All right, joining me for a special edition of Cobbled Together called Kiev'd Together is my co-host, Kristy Pirano. Kristy, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I think we're basically going to just discuss what I think is the breaking news from Friday afternoon, which is that U.S. intelligence believes that there is going to be an invasion this coming week. It's going to start with an aerial bombardment, and eventually troops are going to deploy across the border with the possible goal of regime change in Ukraine. Do you want to speak about like what we know since then and like what could happen?
Well, I think Russia's denying that they're planning that, but we know that they have amassed 100,000 troops and specialty equipment and everything on the border with Ukraine. And then, I mean, initially the Biden administration had deployed some more troops over to Europe, sort of maybe as a peacekeeping force, but then they seem to have chickened out of any ideas of like stationing U.S. troops in Ukraine as a deterrent, because now all of a sudden it's like, oh, here, let's just get everyone out that we can, like saying that U.S. troops are going to leave Ukraine and support them from afar. So it really just sort of looks like getting out of the line of fire because they're anticipating something happening. Of course, they're saying that they don't, this is just out of an abundance of caution and things like this. And that's also interesting. They're telling U.S. citizens that they need to get themselves out of there because we're not going to go in and evacuate you like we did in Afghanistan. But it does kind of feel like, well, in some ways it's a very different situation from Afghanistan, but it also is giving us a lot of deja vu, I think, from the chaos in Afghanistan, which is really not resolved. I mean, there's still State Department believes about 200,000 at-risk Afghans who worked with the U.S. who are still trapped in Afghanistan, and they've gotten like one flight. They've got about 300 people out in the last 3 months. Like they got one flight out, and they've had just endless disputes between the Taliban and Qatar on these evacuation flights. So it's like, I do think most U.S. citizens are out of Afghanistan at this point, but a lot of them were actually gotten out by private groups and not the State Department. But it's like they haven't even finished getting U.S. citizens, let alone allies, out of Afghanistan, and now it's sort of feeling like deja vu with telling American citizens to get out of Ukraine as fast as possible, and saying that they're not going to go in and do some sort of a military evacuation there. So yeah, I mean, despite any assurances that we hear about how World War III is not about to start, it's definitely a very concerning situation, seeing Russia's aggression, and everyone else seems to be now resorting to threatening sanctions on Russia if they invade Ukraine, and sort of saying, oh, you'll regret this if you do this, which doesn't really feel like a strong response.
Yeah, but it's also worth noting that Putin is getting boosts from elsewhere in the country. What you're seeing on screen right now is a tweet by Nayib Bukele, who a bunch of right-wing people in my Twitter feed have boosted at various times. This and he's saying this whole nonsense, like saying, oh, it's not about what's going on in Ukraine. The real war is like, the truckers and the people resisting, vaccine mandates, and this is just distraction. When it's amazing how the president of El Salvador can be talking Putin talking points and doing and basically doing the easy work for Putin himself. But why? I always understand, why is it that the right wingers in my feed are boosting this guy? I will never understand it, but that's just what the president of El Salvador has put his 2 cents on at. Look at that, 1 o'clock in the morning last night. So we've got.
Then also, isn't there?
You go ahead.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Oh, well, there's also kind of like a left-wing contingent that wants to blame Ukraine for somehow, I guess, existing and causing this. So there's definitely the victim blaming contingent on the left, and then you have the right wingers saying, oh, this is just a distraction from the real war with the vaccine mandates. So I think it's another example where both the far left and the far right are not really serious about foreign policy that works.
They really aren't.
I mean, like, I think the foreign policy pragmatists tend to be the more moderates, because I mean, the far left tends to be sympathetic to socialists and other autocrats, even while claiming that they're very dedicated to human rights. And then I think like the far right oftentimes has also become sympathetic to autocrats, and it's really, I think it tends to be the people in the middle that are saying, no, we have to stand up to this kind of nonsense. We have to stand for democracy and human rights.
Well, there was a bit of breaking news today, and I'll just put this on screen. Diplomatic sources in Vienna say that Russia has failed to respond to questions raised by Ukraine under the OSCE Vienna document within the 48-hour time frame. The deadline for response expired today at 13:59 CET. Ukraine asked Russia to clarify unusual military activities. Ukraine can now request a meeting under paragraph 16.2, chapter 3 to discuss the matter. It is up to the Polish OSCE chair to convene the meeting within the next 48 hours. So what's that? Do you know what this is all about?
I'm not sure, actually.
Yeah, this might be a little bit beyond our pay grade here.
I mean, Ukraine is not yet in NATO, and of course, it's believed that Putin is afraid of them joining NATO, and it's trying to make a move to. I mean, initially there were like rumors that he was telling Biden that if you promise Ukraine can never join NATO, then it won't invade, and so sort of trying to blackmail the U.S. and other NATO powers to never admit Ukraine to NATO, which it seems like Ukraine is not going to be imminently admitted to NATO, but also the U.S. didn't go for the whole like promise never to admit them thing. So now it seems like Putin is, trying to make good on what was perhaps a bluff to start with, or at least he's, still at least kind of lining things up for this. But this it must be another like convention, maybe at least that European countries signed about.
Yeah,
and probably something that was enacted post World War II to try to prevent them from invading each other.
anyway, I'll bring it back to an easier topic. This will probably be an easier question to answer. In retrospect, should Ukraine have been allowed to keep its nukes? Yeah, I know that's not.
I think the other countries that promised Ukraine, I mean, I think the countries that promised Ukraine to have their back if they gave up their nukes have obviously not done a very good job of keeping that promise. So yeah, I mean, I think in hindsight, Ukraine should have just kept their nukes and been like, we can't trust the US to have our back. I mean, because now Russia's like seriously threatening to invade Ukraine. The US is like, well, here, we're just gonna get out of here before we get shot. And I mean, I think at one point Biden said a few weeks ago that he was not going to send troops to Ukraine, and then he sort of tried to walk it back. He's like, well, I don't know what we'll do. And but obviously Biden kind of wants to just retreat from the world stage. But then what ends up happening is that, and I mean, I'm not the type of person that thinks that, that just gets like a power trip from the US going around and like, having military power or whatever. I mean, there are people that just like enjoy like, oh yeah, we're a superpower, let's just go like boss people around or something. I mean, like that's not where I'm coming from, but I think I tend to lean towards the I mean, I guess what would be more aggressive foreign policy. And that I think the reality is that when the US leaves, you end up with something worse, because you end up with a vacuum that Russia or China or other bad actors decides to fill. And so, I mean, that was my issue with Afghanistan. It wasn't necessarily that the situation we had going on there was that great, but the problem is, what is the downside? And obviously, we left a power vacuum that then then a terrorist group took over the country. So, but yeah, I think it's unfortunate that the U.S. has not been a very reliable ally in recent years. I think we've had more and more domestic disputes and I think there's more of the energy politically that's going into sort of sucking up to a particular base, as opposed to like trying to make decisions in the national interest. But the unfortunate reality is that we're just not standing behind our allies, whether it be like individual Afghans who supported us or countries like Ukraine who gave up their nukes in exchange for a protection agreement from the US. Like, we're just not having people's backs.
Yeah, I'm you talk about NATO, and I'm just looking at this here because apparently I saw a graphic that Josh Hawley is calling on the United States to drop Ukraine's bid, to block Ukraine's bid to join NATO. And what I'm wondering is, I can verify this in a second, but what I'm wondering is, why didn't we admit Ukraine to NATO back when the Soviet Union collapsed? Was it just because the government at the time was pro-Russian, and only recently has it become pro-Western, and that's when Putin is pouncing?
Why didn't we use it?
Yeah, why did we admitted back when the Soviet Union collapsed, we admitted Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia to NATO right away. But we didn't do that for Ukraine or any of the other former Soviet countries. So I'm just curious about how we managed to screw that up.
I don't know. I mean, was it based on, supposedly there's some criteria for NATO that involves some like anti-corruption stuff. I think that's what the claim is now, is that they haven't met all those criteria. But yeah, I wouldn't find it necessarily believable that Lithuania and these other former Soviet states had a material difference.
And Bulgaria is also a NATO member. Yeah, Bulgaria is also a NATO member, and they're quite corrupt.
But also, did Ukraine wish to join NATO back then, or I mean, is it possible?
It's probably the case that they had a pro-Russian government for a long time, and then in 2014, they had a they've had a pro-Western government really in the past few years, ever since Russia started picking them. Like Georgia, for example, was close to Russia up until Russia took off like 2 chunks of their territory, at which point they've drifted into the Western orbit.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting that now the GOP, well, now you have liberals accusing Republicans of being weak on Russia. It sort of seems like things have come full circle, because it's reminiscent of the Romney-Obama debate, where Romney identified Russia as what he thought was the chief geopolitical foe for the US, and then Obama said that it was the 1980s who called and they want their foreign policy back.
Yep.
And Democrats continued to mock Mitt Romney for that statement. And then enter 2016, and the Democrats, especially the far left, had spent 4 years saying that Russia orchestrated for Trump, that Russia did shady stuff and got Trump elected. Like literally, Russia stole the election to instigate Trump, and then also spent 4 years, of course, pointing out, and I mean, like rightfully pointing out that Trump was weak on Russia stuff. And I think the Trump administration was a very interesting combination, actually. Like at the beginning, they not that they were ever that hard on Russia, but at the beginning I think like maybe some of the national security people working in the Trump administration were more traditional Republicans when it came to Russia policy. I think Trump himself was pretty sympathetic to Putin, and then it seemed like as the years went by, Trump's sort of natural inclination to not stand up to Russia ended up becoming a stronger force. And as more and more of maybe his traditionalist Republican foreign policy advisors either retired or got ignored. But then, I mean, I honestly thought that because the Democrats had spent 4 years talking about how Trump was weak on Russia, I thought the Biden administration was going to make it a point to be anti-Russia. But the Biden administration has been a real pushover with Russia. I mean, like probably even worse than the Trump administration, after having criticized Trump for that. And now you have liberals like John Cooper back to saying that, the Republicans are Putin's puppets, which, I mean, yeah, that may very well, I mean, I think that is true, that there are still some very like pro-Putin Republicans, but it's not. But the Democrats are the ones in power now, and they're not exactly doing a very good job of living up to all of their promises about like standing up to Putin.
Yeah, I mean, there's also, I think, you want to talk about like some way some other countries are responding, because there's criticism of Germany for blocking the transfer of defensive equipment to Ukraine, but there's also criticism of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. I think a lot of people see that he was initially like too slow to sort of emphasize the threat to Ukrainians. Like he was trying to downplay it and saying there's nothing to worry about. We've got it under control. When in reality, there is a real danger to Ukrainian lives. So a lot of people are criticizing him for not communicating the urgency. But what do you think that there are countries, including Ukraine itself, that are worthy of criticism in this regard?
Yeah, well, I mean, I mean, pretty much every country is going to be, but some to more extent than others. But yeah, I mean, I think some countries have done a better job of standing up to Russia than others. Germany has generally been like pretty weak on Russia. They've
Yeah,
been the number one. They've been like really behind pushing this Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which I guess now the U.S. is threatening to like try to block that if Putin invades Ukraine. But I think thought is that Germany has become fairly dependent on like natural gas from Russia. So
yeah,
that makes them not want to ruffle
yeah.
feathers over there.
Imagine if we approved Keystone XL. I wish we should go back and approve that. I wish we could construct the Keystone XL pipeline at this point.
Yeah, that's been a big political football for both of the parties. But yeah, it is kind of ironic that the Biden administration is like supporting the Nord Stream 2 and blocking the Keystone pipeline. And I think part of the pushback on the Keystone pipeline is that a lot of it, the intended use is to like try to retrieve oil from some of these like tar sands in Canada, and it does take a huge amount of energy to process those, so it's not very environmentally favorable. It's not like a very environmentally friendly source of energy. So I think that's part of the reason that environmentalists went after the Keystone pipeline, maybe more so than other pipelines, but also it sort of feels like it also feels like there's sort of like a self-punishment thing that goes on with sometimes with the environmental movement. It's like they'll be very particular about like something that's happening in country and like, oh, we should all drive electric cars or whatever. And electric cars have their own whole set of issues, like where you get lithium for batteries and where you get the
Yeah,
electricity and stuff like that. But sometimes I feel like the environmental movement is really focused on domestic stuff, and then if it's international, it's like, oh, it's none of our business.
yeah. And what I'd like to
Even
point out,
though
sorry, what I'd like to point out is that I've talked about this, is that the people who advocate against pipelines are generally not serious about environmental issues, because if oil and natural gas are not being transported by pipeline, they're still going to be transported, just going to be transported by train, where it has a greater chance of derailing and polluting the environment.
right, I think though I mean, at least the arguments I heard people making against the Keystone pipeline, their argument was that there was going to be more of this extraction of the oil from the tar sands if there's this pipeline, this easy way to transport it. And whether or not that may be flawed logic, but that was their argument, is that this is there's a lot of environmental impact from this particular fossil fuel source, even more so than other fossil fuels. So having this pipeline is going to encourage that. I guess my point is just that there's obvious geopolitical things going on, and I think it's a geopolitics and not the environmental life cycle analysis that's the driving force behind the Nord Stream versus Keystone stuff. But I mean, my understanding of the two projects is that the Keystone pipeline would be facilitating a less environmentally friendly energy extraction maybe than the Nord Stream. That's not to say that I'm happy about the Nord Stream. I think the reason that the Germany wants the Nord Stream pipeline because they want to be able to facilitate buying energy from Russia, and Biden administration doesn't want to. They want to just give Germany what they want.
And the upside is
that benefit them economically and not rock the boat.
And the upside is that when Russia turns off the taps to Ukraine, it won't affect Germany anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if Russia does invade Ukraine, like what kind of sanctions can we expect that the West is going to impose on them? Like what kind of like assets are they gonna target? Like what kind of companies are they gonna target? Can we expect that Russia will be ejected from the SWIFT system?
I don't know. I mean, I know that President Biden recently made a statement about how Russia can't imagine how much they're going to regret this or something, but I think it was kind of short on specifics. I mean, I guess if Russia invades Ukraine, then that's like a dramatic thing, but I mean, given how much China and even the Taliban do, well, of course, Taliban is not like a recognized government, but obviously world powers kind of want to downplay the Taliban's atrocities just to sort of normalize them and not have to take responsibility for getting more Afghans out of Afghanistan. And I mean, China had this just pretend that that's not an issue. So I guess that those data points don't make me real optimistic about a really strong and coordinated response that is an actual deterrent to Russia. But on the other hand, it is kind of a dramatic thing if you like go and, after decades of, not having countries of this size, like just straight up invading each other. I mean, that could be something that is, even just allowing that to happen could be something that's embarrassing enough for the West that they actually like do a better job of responding than they have with some of these other things. But I don't know. I guess I'm not super optimistic about the Biden administration coming down really hard on Russia and making them really regret this. I mean, I hope I'm wrong, but I don't feel optimistic about that.
So I just saw this come up across my feed. It's been a pretty slow news day today, but CBS has learned that the Biden administration is preparing to withdraw all U.S. personnel from Kiev within the next 24 to 48 hours. So things appear to be escalating, or something.
Yeah, the last I had seen, they were talking about like all basically everyone who could leave should leave, and now, that is very concerning because that seems like U.S. intel is indicating that things are getting worse.
Yeah, I wish there was a way we could expel Russia from the UN Security Council, and they could take China with them as well.
Yeah, that is such a joke because even the UN Human Rights Committee basically is like Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and stuff like that. It's like literally the world's worst human rights abusers that all sit on the Human Rights Committee. And I mean, like the National Security Council is like some of the countries that are like doing the worst to contribute to destabilizing the world that are sitting on the UN Security Council, and it just makes the UN kind of a joke.
It really does.
I mean, basically the UN Human Rights Commission just sits there and passes resolutions against Israel and says nothing about Saudi Arabia and Venezuela and the others that are definitely not democracies and are definitely committing mass atrocities. I'm with you. I think that bad actors should not be given leadership roles at the UN, but unfortunately that's not the case.
Well, all the reporters seem to be busy watching the games, so there's really not a lot of updates here to talk about. It's quite possible something could happen in the next couple of days, and we might actually have to record again. Do you want to give like a brief rundown about what's going on in Yemen these days? Because I've heard some people talk about that, because you also mentioned Saudi Arabia, and so why don't we bring up Yemen as well?
Yeah, I haven't been tracking the Yemen situation that closely recently. Actually, I've been pretty involved in Afghanistan, and then nowadays watching what's going on in Ukraine as well.
I think the cameras have sort of turned away from Afghanistan now, because I never hear about anything.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that. No, I agree. It's kind of like some of that is just because the Biden administration and any news media sympathetic to them doesn't want to like keep talking about that. There was some news this last week though, because the military released a report that was based on several officers' sworn testimony detailing problems with the Afghan withdrawal. And someone asked the president about it, and he said, "Well, I reject the findings." Just like denying that his administration did anything wrong despite a military report documenting the opposite. So that's been that's been in the news the last couple of days about that report and its findings, and then the president's statement that he doesn't accept any of them. I guess he kind of thinks he can do like Trump and just be like, no, I don't, and just sort of make people believe
hasn't his response like to question hasn't his responses to questions about Ukraine like been kind of Trumpian these days?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it really seems like, and also a lot of the Afghanistan stuff, it does kind of feel like Trump, like just bugging out of Afghanistan, and then yeah, no, I'm not going to accept this report that says I or my administration messed up. Yeah, and I agree. I think a lot of the stuff he said about Ukraine has also, like, if it was reported that Trump said that, it would be very believable. So yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. We're gonna keep on this. And I should point out, if you, because we talk about Afghanistan, if you and I got the chance to interview Clarissa Ward, who did that on the ground reporting in Afghanistan, I think I would consider my I've reached the apex of what this podcast can do. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be awesome to interview her.
Yeah. So Kristy, thank you so much for joining me. We'll keep on this, and we'll come back if something big happens again.
Yeah. Yeah. And remember, if anyone who's able to donate to ongoing efforts to help Afghan allies, we have the organization that I and a few others co-founded, is the Kurdish Alliance of North America. I also volunteer with a couple other organizations that are continuing to help a few Afghan ally families. So if anyone's able to donate to that, we definitely appreciate it.
Yep, and follow Kristy at on Twitter at Kristy Pirano, and me at Red Hill John. I have a new Twitter handle now, and yeah, we'll have those links to all those organizations that Kristy mentioned for you to support if you can. And we will see you guys next time.